Ancient biblical prophets wrote about the future. Today, theologians are poring over those scriptures with a firm belief that their prophecies are coming to pass. Journey now into the world of eschatology on Prophecy in the News with author and lecturer J.R. Church.
The churches of Philadelphia and Laodicea appear to be prophecies of the end-time church. Beginning around the early 1700s until this very day, it seems that Philadelphia and Laodicea have grown together. Gary Stearman and I are here to discuss revealing revelation and the letters to the churches of Philadelphia and Laodicea.
Philadelphia, the church of brotherly love. And indeed it is. Revelation 3:7 says, "And to the angel of the church of Philadelphia write these things, saith he that is holy, he that is true, he that hath the key of David, he that openeth, and no man shutteth, and shutteth, and no man openeth." J.R., the key of David. Very interesting expression.
We have this church, this letter to the church at Philadelphia. And the city itself was founded around 189 years before the birth of Christ. I have an article that I've written in our October edition of our magazine entitled "The Age of Philadelphia," in which I wrote, "The city was founded near the Cogamus River, 105 miles from Smyrna, and 28 miles southeast of Sardis. It stood on a terrace about 650 feet above the sea level on the main highway leading to the interior of the country from Lydia to Phrygia. Philadelphia was founded by Eumenes the second, king of Pergamus, or the Pergamum Empire actually, and named in honor of his beloved brother Attalus II, who was given the title Philadelphus. And it seemed that Laodicea and the people the people of Philadelphia were a loving type people, zealous for the Greek culture, and because Philadelphia was not located in a place where they could build a fortress for the protection of any particular empire, it actually was a city of education, a city for disseminating the Greek culture. So it was from the very beginning a missionary city, Gary. It was in charge of missions.
Culturally, very interesting. It was sort of isolated. It was not a great coastal city. It was not up in the mountains. It wasn't really economically important. And you know, in the description to the church of Philadelphia in Revelation, it says, "Thou hast a little strength." Philadelphia was not noted for being a stronghold of any sort. It was not noted for being a real power, and yet it did have the distinguishing factor of faithfulness or fidelity or love.
And Philadelphia was also a wealthy city. There was sort of a trade center there. As for the coastal cities, when they began to decline, Philadelphia grew in power and retained its importance even until the late Byzantine Empire. And this is a picture of the future age of Philadelphia, which, Gary, I would say began somewhere around 1727 in the Great Awakening. Now, you've got to understand that the world was coming out of the Dark Ages. And the Roman Church had been fragmented by the Reformers, the Reformation movement, when Bibles began to be printed in the 1530s, beginning with the Gutenberg Bible. And so the average man suddenly could get a hold of a Bible, put it in his own home, and read it for himself. And this then led to a desire to return to the literal interpretation of Scripture. But the Reformed churches, the Reformation or Protestant churches as they were called, were still somewhat dead in their orthodoxy. They felt that just being a member of that church was enough to get a person to heaven. There was no real evangelism. In fact, out of even the Church of England, for example, even in the 1700s and 1800s, a family bought their own pew. and nobody else could sit on that pew. We just have remnants of that today with little signs saying, "This is my seat, don't you sit here."
Yeah. Well, J.R., it's very interesting. So as a historical entity, Philadelphia was a little off the beaten path, perhaps. After the great cities fell, it continued on. Metaphorically, then, it becomes the church that stands for God's grace in action, following the Reformed churches, which really clung a lot to the formalism of the Dark Ages. Philadelphia was a time when everything blossomed, and a number of people got the idea that, hey, this gospel message is for the whole world. We can't keep it to ourselves anymore. And that's really the heart of the Philadelphian idea.
Yes. Coming out of the dead orthodoxy of the Protestant movement, and which, by the way, in itself was commended by the Lord in the church at Sardis. Still, we did not have a flaming evangelism. We did not have soul-winning activity. But the Pietist movement in the Moravian community of Germany began to hold prayer meetings in 1727. They launched prayer meetings 24 hours a day. And because of that, some 300 Moravian missionaries spread out throughout Europe and even over to America, taking the revival fires with them. And so it all started in Germany, in the Moravian community. I think that is most interesting because, Gary, that's where Laodicea started as well.
Absolutely, and which is pretty astounding, J.R. So this gives then a little bit of meaning to the idea of opening and shutting a door, having the key of David. Suddenly things are beginning to happen in this church.
Well, you know, with the missionary movement, and William Carey was the father of modern missions, with the missionary movement and the societies, several societies in London, for example, that was the Particular Baptist Missionary Society, the British Foreign Bible Society, the Religious Tract Society, the London Missionary Society, and the Church Missionary Society. By the turn of the century, in fact, by the early 1900s, with the turn of the century of 1901, 1900, 1901, the English missionaries numbered over 10,000 missionaries going all over the world. So that century and a half was tremendous with taking the gospel to the ends of the earth, and we thank the British missionary movements for doing that. The interesting thing is, suddenly these backward nations all over the world wanted their people to learn how to read and to learn English and to learn the culture of Great Britain and to learn right from wrong, the morals and morals. So the missionaries were welcome. It was an open door. As opposed to the last few decades, Gary, when many of the countries are shutting the doors. Even in America, Christian bashing is the latest American sport. The doors are closing, folks. We're entering the waning days of Philadelphia.
Well, it's interesting to look by contrast back at the late 19th and early 20th centuries during the time of the great missionary movements, J.R. As you say, there was an open door, a welcome mat. People, when they went to the Orient, they were well received. They came as doctors and nurses as well as missionaries. And they founded schools and they taught English all across India and across China. And they became bastions, or little lights, if you will, outposts of the light of God. Interestingly, at the same time, the British Empire reached its zenith. And I believe that that was the hand of God. As long as the British were honoring the Lord, they were Great Britain. But later on, as passions cooled, and as we'll see toward the Laodicean period, where people declined any longer to believe in the divine inspiration of the Word of God, that whole movement shrunk back. And one by one, the crown colonies were lost and overturned and became socialistic. And today, you not only can't find 10,000 missionaries in England, I'm wondering if you can find 10,000 Bible-believing Christians in England.
Well, the age of Philadelphia is certainly the age of missions and the age of mass evangelism. At the same time, of course, Laodicea with the age of reason, began to develop the modernist movement, liberal theology. And liberal theology had to attack two special things in the Bible that makes the Bible unique from any other book in history. One is miracles. They said the miracles are fables, they're fairy tales. Secondly, prophecy. The Bible has no prophecies. It's all history.
Yes.
So this attack marked Laodicea. No miracles and no prophecies. And they were wealthy as well, which we'll get to, of course, in time. We'll be back in just a moment. The letter to the church at Philadelphia was a prophecy of modern evangelistic Gentile Christianity. And the interesting thing about it is that it all started around 1727 in the Moravian community of Germany. And over the next 65 years, as these great revivals spread and as the Moravians' prayer meetings continued, and by the way, 24 hours a day for 30 years. Can you imagine? And they sent out 300 missionaries that greatly influenced Christians in England and America. About the same time, evangelism was felt among the Presbyterians in America through the ministry of Gilbert Tennant, whose father founded the well-known Log College that later became Princeton University. From there, revival spread to the Baptists of Pennsylvania and Virginia, and like a raging fire across early America under the ministry of Jonathan Edwards, who preached sinners in the hands of an angry God. That's a great message. In 1739, the English evangelist George Whitefield preached a series of revivals in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. And during the period of the Great Awakening, 9 Bible colleges were established in America. Church membership exploded. Wild frontier towns were tamed with the gospel. The missionary movement of that period brought men like David Brainerd to preach among the Indians. In England, George Whitefield and John Wesley were having phenomenal results. Whitefield preached in virtually every village in England, Scotland, and Wales, crossing the Atlantic 7 times to hold revivals in America, preaching some 18,000 sermons. In 1739, John Wesley preached an open-air revival at Bristol, and he witnessed the beginning of a phenomenal stirring among the people. A reaction that has continued to this day. We call it the era of mass evangelism. Over a period of about 65 years, Wesley traveled 250,000 miles on horseback, preached 40,000 sermons, wrote 233 books, and with his brother Charles, published 9,000 hymns. Wow. His ministry produced 750 preachers in England and 350 in America, just from one man's lifetime. That was during his lifetime, not since, but just during his lifetime, over 1,000 preachers. And 76,986 Methodists in England and 57,000 Methodists in America. That's just during his lifetime. So the Great Awakening of 1727 saw a phenomenal results of mass evangelism and then the great missionary movements. We can see that evangelism and soul-winning efforts through D.L. Moody of the last century, Billy Sunday, and of course Billy Graham, I guess, is the most famous of all.
Well, and I'm remembering Charles Haddon Spurgeon of the Metropolitan Church in London, England. Thousands upon thousands of people were converted under his teaching, and he would just preach routinely week after week there in the Metropolitan Church in London. You know, J.R., when you mentioned the Log College that became Princeton,
yes.
I'm thinking about Princeton University today. It's certainly not known as a Christian center.
Well, you see, Laodicea stole it.
Yes.
That's the only way to explain it. Harvard was once a Baptist college for teaching preachers how to preach, and look at it today, the bastion of communism and socialism.
Right, absolutely.
So well, one of the ministers who grew up in the early 1700s was William Carey. Man, he was as poor as dirt, Gary. And yet he had a desire to take the gospel to the world, especially to India. England had a company, you know, called the East India Company at that time, and he wanted to go to India so bad, but he didn't know how to finance it. He talked to all of the preachers in his little society. They get together, you know, periodically for fellowship and preaching and so on. And he tried to talk them into building a missionary society, and it just never worked until finally one day it clicked, and they put together this missionary society, and he became the first missionary. In fact, he was the first missionary, period, outside of the Apostle Paul, of course, in his missionary journeys. So William Carey became the father of modern missions, so named because he was the first of the modern missionary movement. Upon arriving in India, William Carey formed a team of men to translate the Bible into 34 Asian languages. They compiled dictionaries in Sanskrit and other languages, several different languages. They formed a Bible college, started churches, and established 19 mission stations. They opened 100 rural schools and encouraged the education of girls. Carey started the Horticultural Society in in India, served as a professor at Fort William College in Calcutta, and printed the first Indian weekly newspaper called The Friend of India, and even started a savings bank to assist poor people. He preached for 7 years without a single convert.
And you know, J.R., I'm thinking through all this historically that this is in the era of the apex of Great Britain.
Yes.
The British Empire was used by God literally as a tool to send these missionaries all over the world. Of course, we remember Hudson Taylor, many books, even a film, a very famous film made about the life of Hudson Taylor as he evangelized China. And millions and millions of souls were saved over there.
Yes, William Carey was in the 1790s, and Hudson Taylor was in the 1830s. He was born in Yorkshire in 1832. He came to know the Lord after reading a Christian tract. He sailed for China at the age of 21 in 1853, arriving in Shanghai in the spring. And by 1995, the China Inland Mission, which was his missionary movement, had 641 missionaries, 462 Chinese helpers, and 260 mission stations. During the Boxer Rebellion, 56, and that's in the year 1900, 56 of these missionaries were martyred and hundreds of Chinese Christians were killed, but that didn't stop the work. It continued until the Chinese communists took over in the late 40s, early 50s.
And of course, this brief rundown on missionary activity would not be complete without talking about David Livingstone in Africa, because what he did in Africa is one of the great stories of the 19th century.
Born in 1813, he gave himself to be a medical missionary to the black people of Africa, and became a doctor of medicine in 1838, an ordained minister in 1840, answered the call to South Africa in 1841. The interesting thing is, Gary, that from 1866 to 1873, Livingstone explored the source of the Nile River. He then turned to the Congo River and reached the Lualaba tributary, and then, of course, you remember Stanley looking for him and finally found him on Lake Tanganyika in 1871, and he had malaria. He died May 1st, 1873. His body was buried in Westminster Abbey, but his heart was buried in Africa. One of the great missionaries of the last century.
And so we discussed the spirit of the church of Philadelphia, seen in Revelation 3:7 through 13. J.R., this church is not without its struggles. We see these in the scriptural passages. It's got an open door, to be sure, but it also has the synagogue of Satan, which would be the opponents of the Philadelphian church. Here in verse 9, behold, I will make them of the synagogue of Satan, which say they are Jews and are not. I'll make them to come and, in a brief word, bow down before you and confess their guilt. That synagogue of Satan is a vast class of unbelievers. Those who say they are Jews and are not, in my opinion, are those who are replacement theologians. That is, they say, we have inherited the promises that made through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to the 12 tribes.
And you see, Laodicea grew up with Philadelphia. We don't have the age of Philadelphia, then the age of Laodicea. They both started in the early 1700s, the 1720s. And so this synagogue of Satan became this existentialism, this replacement theology, the age of reason, the age of Nietzsche, who said God is dead.
Yes.
And they attacked the miracles of the Bible. That couldn't possibly be true. They're just fables. They attacked the prophecies of the Bible. And we see them as the ivory tower professors of the universities that used to be evangelistic but have been taken over by the synagogue of Satan. Wow. It's an incredible study, Philadelphia and Laodicea. We've seen Philadelphia today. Our next program, we'll see Laodicea. We'll be back in just a moment.